New Hampshire may be small, but its landscape holds some of the most intriguing mysteries in New England. From strange stones carved with unknown symbols to forests swallowed by the sea, the state is filled with places that blur the line between history, legend, and natural wonder. These ancient puzzles invite us to look closer, question what we think we know, and wonder about the secrets still hidden in the granite state. Lake Winnipasuokee Mystery Stone. In 1872, workers digging near Lake Winnipasuki came across something that didn't belong in the soil of New Hampshire. It was a dark, egg-shaped stone, polished smooth, small enough to fit in your hand, yet covered with strange carvings that no one could explain. That discovery would go on to be called the Lake Winnipasuokee Mystery Stone. And even today, more than 150 years later, it still raises more questions than answers. The stone itself is striking, about 4 in tall, perfectly oval, shaped almost like an old paper weight. But what sets it apart are the carvings. On one side is a face, its eyes and nose clearly visible. Other parts show cornstalks, arrows, circles, a spiral, even a kind of teepee or wigwam shape. And then there's a hole drilled straight through the stone. So precise and clean, it looks like it was made with a modern metal tool rather than something from centuries ago. The combination of artwork and technique just doesn't seem to fit into the local history we know. The workers who found it weren't searching for artifacts. They were digging a fence post for a local businessman when the stone came up from the earth. From the moment it was brought into the light, people started asking the same questions. Who carved it? How old is it? Why was it buried near the lake? And maybe the strangest question of all, how did someone in an age long before drills manage to bore a perfect hole through such a hard piece of stone? One theory suggests it could have been Native American in origin, maybe carved as a ceremonial object or a gift between tribes. The cornstalks and arrow shapes support that idea since they're symbols tied to native culture. But the problem is the drilled hole. Native peoples in the region didn't typically use the kind of technology that could create something so precise. And there's no real evidence of other artifacts like this turning up in New England. Another idea is that it could have been created by early European settlers or even much later in history, maybe as a 19th century novelty item. People point out that the hole looks suspiciously like the result of a modern tool, which might mean the whole thing is not ancient at all. If that were true, though, why bury it in the ground where no one would see it? It doesn't really make sense. Over the years, some researchers even suggested the stone could have been an ancient diplomatic gift. The egg shape is unusual, and it's possible it was meant as a peace offering, symbolizing life or rebirth. If that's the case, maybe it was passed from one person to another until eventually, for reasons lost to time, it was buried. But without proof, it remains speculation. The spiral carving on the stone has drawn particular attention. Spirals show up in ancient art all over the world, often connected with cycles of life or the movement of the sun. Seeing it on an artifact in New Hampshire makes people wonder whether it was part of a broader symbolic system or just a local artist experimenting. Then again, it could be nothing more than decoration. The mystery is that we simply don't know. Today, the stone is kept at the New Hampshire Historical Society in Concord, where it sits on display. If you visit, you can stand in front of it and look closely at the carvings. The first impression is that it feels older than it probably is. The smoothness of the surface, the way the lines are cut, it suggests care and intention. At the same time, there's a nagging thought in the back of your mind that maybe it isn't as ancient as we want it to be. Maybe it's a trick of history, something created much later that just happened to look mysterious enough to spark endless debate. The conditions for the stone today are both good and bad. On the positive side, it's well preserved in a climate-controlled case, safe from damage or weathering. Anyone interested in New Hampshire's past can see it up close without worrying about it being lost. On the negative side, keeping it in a museum robs it of its original context. We don't know exactly where in the soil it was found, or if there were other artifacts nearby that could have explained it. That lack of context means the mystery may never be solved. Because archaeology depends so much on surroundings, once an artifact is taken out of the ground without careful records, a lot of its story disappears forever. My own opinion is somewhere in the middle. I don't think the stone is a hoax, but I'm not convinced it's thousands of years old either. It could easily be a piece from the 1700s or 1800s, carved with symbols that were already floating around in native and European culture. Maybe it was made by someone with access to more advanced tools, and the hole was drilled out as part of a handle or ornament. At the same time, the way it was buried, the lack of records, and the mix of carvings give it a timeless quality. You can stand there and imagine it belonging to any number of different cultures, and that's part of what makes it powerful. There's also something to be said for the mystery itself. Not every artifact has to be fully explained to have value. Sometimes the questions are just as important as the answers, because they make us think about the people who came before, the lives they lived, and the symbols they cared about. Whether the Mystery Stone is 200 years old or 2,000, it's still a reminder that objects carry meaning, and meaning doesn't always survive the passage of time. When you see the face carved into the stone with its eyes staring back at you, it feels oddly human. Whoever made it wanted to leave a mark. They wanted their work to be seen. That intention has succeeded, even if the details are lost. And the drilled hole, perfect and out of place, almost seems to say that not everything fits neatly into the categories we use to describe the past. Standing in front of it today, in the calm, quiet museum in Concord, you get both a sense of closeness to history and a sense of distance. You're close because the object is right there, untouched for centuries, but you're distant because the story is gone. The carvings are like a language you can't quite read, giving you fragments without translation. The present situation of the stone is stable, but unsatisfying. It's safe, displayed, and accessible to anyone curious about New Hampshire's mysteries. That's the positive side. The negative is that it may remain forever unsolved. With no new discoveries linked to it, no other objects to compare it with, and no way to pinpoint its age with confidence. The Lake Winnipasuokee Mystery Stone may always sit in its glass case as more of a question than an answer. And maybe that's fitting, because not every mystery in history is meant to be solved. Some are meant to keep us wondering. Neville Archaeological Site. On the banks of the Merrimack River in Manchester, New Hampshire, there's a stretch of land that looks ordinary at first glance. Today, it's surrounded by neighborhoods, traffic, and the hum of daily life. But thousands of years ago, this place was alive with the rhythm of early human activity. It's known as the Neville Archaeological Site, and it holds some of the oldest evidence of people living in New England. The site doesn't have the same dramatic appearance as stone chambers or mysterious carvings, but its quiet importance comes from the story it tells about survival, adaptation, and change. The Neville site first gained attention in the 1960s when archaeologists uncovered stone tools, fire pits, and signs of repeated occupation. What they found dated back to around 8,000 years ago, during what's called the Middle Archaic period. That makes it one of the oldest known settlements in the region. To put that in perspective, people were living and working here long before the pyramids of Egypt were even built. It's a reminder that New Hampshire has a human story stretching back farther than most of us realize. One of the standout discoveries at the site was a specific type of spear point, now known as the Neville point. These were carefully shaped stone tips, longer and narrower than earlier styles, designed to be attached to wooden shafts. They show how technology was advancing, how hunters were improving their tools to match the challenges of their environment. Finding so many of these points in one place tells us that the people here weren't just passing through. They were returning again and again, relying on the resources of the Merrimack River. The river itself was the lifeline. It provided fish, fresh water, and a natural travel route. In a world without roads, rivers were highways, linking different groups and allowing trade and communication. Alongside the tools, archaeologists found hearths, evidence of cooking fires, along with bone fragments and other remains that suggest meals were shared here. You can almost picture small groups gathered around the fire, preparing food, shaping tools, and talking as the river flowed beside them. But while the basics of life, hunting, fishing, cooking are clear, so much about the people remains unknown. We don't know what they called themselves, what languages they spoke, or the beliefs that guided their days. No written records exist, only stone and soil to hint at their story. And yet, those hints matter. Every spear point and fire pit connects us to people who adapted to this landscape with skill and creativity. The mystery deepens when you think about why the site was eventually abandoned. People lived here for centuries, but at some point they stopped returning. Was it climate change? Did resources shift? Did new technologies make other locations more practical? Archaeologists can only guess, piecing together patterns from what remains. It's a reminder of how fragile human settlements can be, shaped by forces beyond our control. One of the fascinating aspects of the Neville site is how it bridges past and present. When you look at the artifacts, you see continuity in human behavior. The need to eat, to stay warm, to find security, it's the same needs we have today, just met in a very different way. A chipstone point from 8,000 years ago and a metal fishing hook from the present both tell the same story. Survival requires tools, and tools carry the imprint of the people who made them. Today, the site itself doesn't look like much. It's not a tourist attraction with big ruins or dramatic monuments. In fact, the land is mostly covered over, part of the modern cityscape. The artifacts are stored in museums and collections, protected but removed from their original setting. That's both a positive and a negative. On the positive side, it means the fragile evidence has been saved. Stone points and bone fragments could easily have been lost if the land had been built over without excavation. On the negative side, it means the site no longer has a visible presence. If you were to stand there today, you wouldn't see the signs of ancient hearths or the traces of tools being crafted. You'd see houses, roads, and businesses. The connection to the past is hidden, almost invisible, unless you know the story. The preservation of artifacts is important, but context matters too. Archaeology is about more than objects. It's about understanding how those objects fit into the world they came from. When sites are disrupted, even carefully, some of that context disappears. With Neville, we have a lot of valuable information, but there are still gaps we'll never fill. That's the negative side of studying ancient places in areas where modern development pushes in. Personally, I find the Neville site fascinating because it reminds us that New Hampshire's history isn't just colonial houses or Revolutionary War landmarks. Long before that, long before towns or borders, there were people here who knew the land in ways we can barely imagine. They could read the river, track the animals, and find food in the changing seasons. Their knowledge wasn't written down, but it's carried in the artifacts they left behind. Standing on that ground today, even if it looks ordinary, you can feel the weight of time layered beneath the surface. It's easy to overlook a place like Neville because it doesn't have the visual drama of a stone circle or the eerie mystery of a carved object, but in some ways it's even more powerful. It's not a puzzle designed to confuse us. It's a real record of ordinary life preserved by chance. That's what makes it human. The people who lived here weren't trying to leave behind a monument. They were just living their lives. And what they left tells us that those lives mattered. The present situation of the Neville Archaeological Site is stable in one sense, but disappointing in another. The artifacts are safe, stored and studied, and they've shaped our understanding of the archaic period in New England. That's the positive. The negative is that the site itself is largely gone as a physical landscape. It's part of a city now, paved and built over with little to indicate to a passerby that anything extraordinary ever happened there. For visitors, that makes it less satisfying. You can't walk through and see the outlines of ancient hearths or the scatter of stone chips. You have to rely on imagination, guided by what archaeologists uncovered decades ago. In the end, Neville is one of those places where the real mystery isn't about strange carvings or unexplained structures, but about people themselves, who they were, what they believed, how they lived, and why they left. Those questions may never be fully answered, but the site gives us enough to know that the answers existed, carried in lives as real and complex as our own. And that, in itself, is worth holding on to. Endicott Rock, Endicott. In the town of Wees Beach, along the edge of Lake Winnipasuki, there's a rock that seems at first like any other granite outcrop you might stumble over in New Hampshire. But when you get closer, you notice something unusual carved into its surface. Letters and numbers etched into stone almost 4 centuries ago. This is Endicott Rock, one of the earliest colonial inscriptions in New England. And while it doesn't have the same kind of mystery as ancient artifacts buried in the ground, it carries its own puzzle. What exactly were those early surveyors thinking? And how did they end up carving such a lasting record in such an odd place? The story of Endicott Rock goes back to 1652, when colonial authorities in Massachusetts Bay Colony wanted to secure their northern boundary. At the time, maps were rough sketches at best, and surveys often relied on landmarks rather than precise measurements. The Merrimack River was key. The colony's charter defined its northern border as being 3 miles north of the river's headwaters. That definition, though, required knowing exactly where the river began. So surveyors were sent out to find the source. Led by Edward Johnson and Simon Willard, the surveyors made their way up through the wilderness, following the river into what's now central New Hampshire. Their journey was difficult. Dense forests, no clear trails, and the constant need to carry supplies. Eventually, they reached Lake Winnipasuki, which they believed to be the river's origin. To mark their discovery and claim the land for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they decided to carve their names and the date into a prominent rock at the outlet of the lake. Among the names inscribed was that of John Endicott, the governor of Massachusetts at the time, even though he wasn't physically there. The carvings are still visible today. They include the initials of the surveyors, the date 1652, and the name Endicott. For colonists, it was a symbol of authority and possession. But there's an irony here. They were wrong. The Merrimack River doesn't actually begin at Lake Winnipes. It starts at the confluence of the Pemigewasset and Winnipasuki rivers some miles away. The surveyor's mistake highlights just how uncertain early colonial geography really was, and how much was based on assumption rather than hard evidence. That mistake had real consequences. For years, boundaries between Massachusetts and New Hampshire were contested, with both colonies laying claim to overlapping land. The carving on Endicott Rock was meant as solid proof of Massachusetts' claim, but later generations used it as evidence of how flawed the survey had been. When disputes eventually went to the King of England for resolution, the outcome favored New Hampshire. The rock, intended as a proud marker of colonial expansion, became instead a relic of confusion. What makes Endicott Rock so interesting isn't just the carving itself, but what it represents. It's one of the oldest pieces of colonial writing in stone in the United States. While native peoples in the area had long made use of rock art, colonial settlers rarely left such physical marks on the landscape. Paper and ink were their usual tools. But paper fades, gets lost, or burns. The decision to carve into granite ensured their presence would endure, and it has. Nearly 400 years later, the letters are still legible. a voice from the 17th century echoing in our time. Standing before the rock today, you can't help but think about the people who did the carving. After weeks of rough travel, hacking through forests and dealing with mosquitoes and rain, they finally arrived at the lake. What must they have felt? Relief, maybe at reaching what they thought was the source of the river. Pride in fulfilling their mission, and a sense of ceremony, chiseling into stone as though to make sure the wilderness itself knew who was in charge. Yet at the same time, their work shows the limits of their understanding. The land was far bigger and far more complex than they realized. The rock sits now inside Endicott Rock State Historic Site, protected by a shelter built around it to keep out the elements. That's the positive side. Without protection, the carving might have eroded away under centuries of wind, rain, and ice. The state park makes it easy for visitors to find, and signs explain the history, so you're not left guessing about its meaning. On a summer day when families are nearby swimming at the beach or boating on the lake, you can step into the quiet shelter and suddenly be face to face with 1652. But there are negatives too. The rock itself isn't visually striking to someone who doesn't know the story. At first glance, it looks like a chunk of granite with faint scratches. If you don't stop to read the explanation, it's easy to dismiss it. And while the shelter protects it, it also makes the rock feel a bit boxed in, cut off from its natural setting. You don't quite get the same sense of wilderness or discovery that the surveyors would have felt when they stood by the lake. There's also the fact that the inscription reflects a colonial mindset, staking a claim to land that already belonged to native peoples. The carving represents power, but it also represents displacement. It's important to remember that while the colonists celebrated their achievement, the people who lived in the region saw something very different. Outsiders laying claim to their home with no understanding of its meaning or history. That layer of the story often gets overlooked, but it's part of what gives Endicott Rock its weight. My own feeling about the site is mixed. On one hand, it's remarkable to have such a direct connection to the 17th century. You don't often get to see handwriting carved in stone that has survived nearly intact for hundreds of years. On the other hand, the carving isn't beautiful in the way of ancient petroglyphs or monuments. It's plain, utilitarian, meant to serve a political purpose. For me, that's what makes it compelling. It's not art, it's evidence. It tells us not just about people, but about their priorities, their ambitions, and their mistakes. If you visit today, you'll find the site well-maintained, though modest. It's not a major tourist draw compared to the lakes or the mountains nearby, but that also gives it a kind of quiet dignity. You can stand there without crowds, take your time tracing the letters with your eyes, and let your thoughts wander back to 1652. The shelter has a bit of a museum-like feel, and while that might strip away some of the natural atmosphere, it also guarantees that generations to come will still be able to see those marks. The present situation at Endicott Rock is one of preservation and education. The positive is clear. The rock is safe, interpreted and accessible, giving locals and visitors alike a glimpse into a very old chapter of colonial history. The negative is that the rock is easy to overlook. Its story drowned out by the busier attractions around Lake Winnipasuki. Without the historical context, it might seem unimpressive. But when you understand what it represents, the ambition of a colony, the mistakes of early surveys, and the clash of perspectives between newcomers and native peoples, it becomes much more than a rock with some scratches. It becomes a symbol of how history is written, both literally and figuratively, into the landscape. And standing there, you can't help but feel a quiet respect for how something so simple has managed to carry so much meaning across so many centuries. Lost River Gorge and Boulder Caves. The Lost River Gorge and Boulder Caves sit hidden in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, in a landscape carved by time and forces we can barely imagine. Walking into the gorge feels like stepping into a different world, where massive boulders lean against one another to form twisting passageways, dark caves, and sudden openings that catch beams of sunlight. The mystery here is not just about the unusual rock formations, but about the deeper question of how these features came to be and what stories they hold from both natural and human history. The gorge itself was shaped around 300 million years ago during a period of intense geological upheaval. Glaciers moved across this land in later ages, scouring valleys and carrying stones of enormous size. When the ice melted, huge granite blocks tumbled and lodged in the narrow ravine, creating the caves and crevices people can still explore today. For geologists, it's an open book about the last ice age. But for visitors, it feels like a labyrinth designed to spark curiosity and a little unease. As you walk among the boulders, the air gets cooler, the light dims, and the sound of water rushing beneath the rocks reminds you that nature is still shaping the gorge even now. One of the most fascinating things about the Lost River is the way water disappears into hidden channels. The river slips between cracks and reappears further downstream, giving the place its name. People who visit for the first time often wonder if there's more to this underground flow than we know. Some have speculated about hidden chambers or undiscovered cave systems beneath the boulders. There's a sense that not everything here has been revealed, and the idea of unexplored passages only adds to the mystique. Indigenous peoples of the region are thought to have known about the gorge long before European settlers arrived. While there are no written records from that time, oral traditions and archaeological clues suggest the caves may have served as shelters or even sacred spaces. The cool, shadowed chambers would have been natural places to seek refuge in harsh weather. But they also carry an atmosphere that feels spiritual. When you stand in one of the darker caves and listen to the dripping water echoing against the stone, it's easy to imagine how ancient people might have viewed this place as a gateway between worlds. The gorge wasn't widely known to outsiders until the 1850s, when a farmer accidentally stumbled across it while searching for a lost sheep. That discovery led to more visitors exploring the caves, and eventually the area became a site of tourism. Today, boardwalks and ladders make it easier to navigate, but you can still sense the raw wilderness beneath the modern structures. For some, that's part of the mystery, how a place once wild and secret has now been made into a carefully managed attraction. There's also the curious case of the names given to different caves. As you move through the gorge, you'll find passages called Devil's Kitchen, Shadow Cave, and the Lemon Squeezer. Each one has its own feel, and some require you to crawl or twist to get through. While these names are playful, they also highlight how the caves can provoke powerful emotions. Fear, excitement, awe. People sometimes speak of feeling watched while inside, or of hearing odd sounds carried by the rushing water. Whether those are just tricks of acoustics or something more, the result is a place where imagination runs wild. Over the years, treasure hunters have even speculated that the caves could hide something more tangible. Stories of lost caches, hidden valuables, or even ancient artifacts occasionally surface in local lore. None of these claims have been proven, but the idea that such a maze of rocks might conceal secrets is hard to dismiss entirely. After all, places like this have a way of keeping their mysteries tucked out of reach. From a modern visitor's perspective, the gorge is a mix of positives and challenges. On the positive side, it's a place of natural beauty that gives people the chance to explore geology firsthand. Families and hikers can walk through landscapes that normally would be too dangerous or inaccessible thanks to the boardwalks. The educational value is also high. Signs explain how glaciers shaped the land, and kids get to see the raw power of nature up close. On the negative side, the very effort to make the gorge accessible can sometimes diminish its wild character. The walkways mean you're never too far from a crowd, and the sense of isolation that might once have been part of the mystery is harder to find. In peak tourist season, the caves echo with voices and footsteps which can take away from the eerie silence that would have been so striking in the past. There's also the fact that the gorge is fragile. Heavy visitation puts stress on the ecosystem, and some argue that too much human presence risks damaging the very features that make it special. Personally, I find myself torn. On one hand, I appreciate that places like the lost River Gorge are open for people to experience. Without that access, many would never get a sense of what glaciers and time have created here. On the other hand, I wonder if part of the gorge's magic lies in the parts that remain hidden. The dark cracks and water channels that no walkway reaches. Maybe the best way to keep its mystery alive is to accept that not every corner needs to be explored or explained. Today, the lost River Gorge and Boulder caves remain a major draw for visitors to New Hampshire. The site is carefully maintained with seasonal operations that allow thousands to pass through its twisting paths each year. The water still rushes beneath the boulders. The caves remain cool and shadowed, and the forest above continues to grow thick around the gorge. It is both a preserved natural wonder and a reminder of how much we still don't know about the ancient forces that shaped our world. Standing there now, you can feel both the weight of history and the thrill of unanswered questions, and that balance is what keeps the mystery alive. Sunken forests of rye. Along the rocky coastline of Rye, New Hampshire, a strange and haunting sight reveals itself when the tide goes out far enough. Dark stumps and roots, weathered by salt water in time, rise up from the sand like the bones of some forgotten world. These are the so-called sunken forests of Rye, remnants of trees that once stood tall thousands of years ago, now trapped beneath the ocean's edge. Walking along the beach and suddenly stumbling across these blackened stumps can feel unsettling, almost like uncovering evidence of a drowned land that nature tried to hide. The story of how they got there reaches back to the end of the last ice age. Around 3,500 to 4,000 years ago, parts of the New Hampshire coastline were very different from what we know today. Sea levels were lower, and areas now covered by ocean were once dry land forested with stands of pine, oak, and hemlock. Over time, as glaciers melted and the climate shifted, the sea began to creep inland. Rising tides drowned those forests, leaving their roots buried under layers of sand and sediment. What we see today are the remains that erosion has uncovered, snapped stumps and tangled roots preserved almost like fossils. For locals and visitors alike, the forests spark curiosity. They are a reminder that the landscape we take for granted is never fixed. Standing by one of those half-buried stumps, it's easy to imagine a time when the shoreline stretched much farther out, and people or animals might have walked through groves of trees where now only waves roll. It raises questions about what else lies beneath the water, hidden from view, and whether other traces of ancient life might still be preserved. Some researchers have studied the wood samples from these stumps, confirming their great age and connecting them to changing sea levels along the Atlantic coast. What's fascinating is that similar sunken forests have been found in other parts of New England, suggesting this was not an isolated event. The forests of Rye are part of a bigger story about how the land and ocean have been in constant motion, trading places over millennia. While science can explain much of this, the emotional effect of seeing those dark stumps against the bright sand still carries a sense of mystery. The sunken forests also connect to local lore. Stories circulate that the stumps appear only after storms or unusually low tides, as if the ocean is reluctantly giving up its secrets for just a short while before reclaiming them again. Some say the forests seem almost alive, that the stumps look like skeletal hands reaching out of the sand. While these are just impressions, they add to the eerie mood of the place. Over the years, the site has drawn treasure hunters and amateur archaeologists. The thought is simple. If entire forests once stood here, could ancient people have lived nearby as well? Could artifacts or signs of early settlements be hidden beneath the seabed? So far, nothing conclusive has been found, but the possibility lingers. With so much land now underwater, it's not far-fetched to wonder what human history might have been lost along with those trees. Visiting the sunken forest today is both awe-inspiring and a little bittersweet. On the positive side, they're a living outdoor museum that costs nothing to see. You can simply walk the beach and stumble upon these remnants of deep time, a reminder of Earth's shifting face. It makes you think differently about the ground under your feet and about how fragile coastlines really are. The forests also create an unusual habitat. Small pools form around the stumps, attracting crabs, fish and seabirds, adding even more life to the scene. But there are negatives too. The stumps are vulnerable, and exposure to salt air, water and human traffic means they are slowly deteriorating. Erosion is a constant problem along the New Hampshire coast. And with climate change bringing more violent storms and rising seas, these ancient remains may not last forever. There's also the issue of accessibility. Because the stumps are only visible at certain tides, and sometimes only after storms, visitors who come hoping to see them often leave disappointed. It's a mystery that doesn't reveal itself on demand, which can frustrate people, but also adds to the allure. From my own perspective, I think the sunken forests are best appreciated not just as geological curiosities, but as reminders of impermanence. They tell us that coastlines shift, climates change, and even great forests can vanish beneath the waves. There's something humbling about that. At the same time, standing next to them, I can't help but feel a quiet thrill, like I'm catching a glimpse of the past that was not meant to last this long. It's not often we get such a physical, tactile connection to a world thousands of years gone. Today, the forests remain a rare and unpredictable sight. At rise beaches, when the tide and weather align, the stumps still rise from the sand, drawing in those lucky enough to be there at the right time. They stand as silent witnesses of a vanished landscape, a reminder that what feels permanent to us is really just a moment in Earth's longer story. Whether you view them as eerie relics or natural wonders, they leave an impression that lingers long after you've walked away.